I am Julian, 35 years old. The night my wife of 10 years celebrated her massive promotion to CEO of Vanguard Ridge Industries, she handed me divorce papers right in the middle of our private celebratory dinner, in front of her entire board of directors. While I sat there in pure shock, looking at the legal documents meant to completely destroy my life, her father looked at me across the table and said, "Read it, unless the words are too big for the house husband." They actually laughed at me. My wife, her parents, and her colleagues chuckled at my humiliation in front of 30 of the most powerful people in the city, treating my destruction like the evening's main entertainment. But there is one thing they did not know. I had been keeping meticulous records of my own for years, and right now, as I speak to you, they are begging a federal judge for leniency to avoid spending the rest of their lives in a concrete cell. Before I tell you exactly what happened and how I brought a billion-dollar empire crashing down on their heads, hit that like button if you believe in true justice. And do not forget to let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Your support means everything to me. Now let us go back to where this nightmare began. I was sitting in the private, velvet-draped dining room of the St. Anthony Hotel. It is the kind of place that smells heavily of old money, expensive imported cigars, and aggressive lemon polish. The crystal chandelier above us was massive, fracturing the warm light into 1,000 jagged rainbows and casting them perfectly over the face of my wife, Victoria. She stood at the head of the long custom mahogany table, holding a crystal champagne flute high in the air. She wore a tailored designer dress that cost more than my first car. Her cheeks were flushed with the kind of absolute victory that only comes from completely crushing someone else and climbing over their back. The board members of Vanguard Ridge Industries were applauding. The sound was polite but heavy, acknowledging the woman who had just been named their new chief executive officer. I was the only one in the room not clapping. My hands were folded in my lap, gripping the heavy, starched cloth napkin so tightly my knuckles had turned pure white. I had spent the last 2 hours listening to speeches about Victoria's singular genius, her unmatched vision, and her supposed self-made journey to the top. Not a single person mentioned the husband who had spent a decade fixing her broken spreadsheets at 3 in the morning. The applause finally died down, replaced by the clinking of expensive silverware against fine china and the low, arrogant hum of self-congratulatory conversation. That was when Victoria sat down, turned her body toward me, and reached under the table. She slid a thick, heavy manila envelope across the pristine white tablecloth. It moved with a loud, sliding rasp that cut directly through the ambient noise of the room. It stopped right next to my untouched plate of sea bass. She did it out in the open for a reason. She did it for the sake of appearances, for the sake of the wealthy investors watching us. She wanted an audience for my execution. She kept a bright, camera-ready smile plastered on her face, but her eyes were completely dead. They were the eyes of a shark that had just smelled blood in the water. "Open it," she mouthed to me. Her voice was just loud enough for the people on either side of us to hear, but quiet enough to maintain the sick facade of a loving intimacy. I looked at the envelope, then at her. My heart began a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. I opened the metal clasp. Inside was a thick stack of legal documents, still warm from the corporate office printer. The bold text at the very top of the first page screamed its intent in capital letters. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Underneath that heading was a brutal settlement agreement and an incredibly strict non-disclosure agreement. I looked up at her. She was watching me with a look of pure, unadulterated arrogance. She had chosen this exact moment, the absolute pinnacle of her career, to discard the ladder she had used to climb there. "Well, go on, Julian." Reginald, my father-in-law, spoke up from across the wide table. His voice was a booming, theatrical baritone, cutting through the room like a serrated knife. He was wearing a custom suit, and he wore his cruelty just as proudly. "Read it, unless the words are too big for the house husband to understand." A few of the board members chuckled nervously. Unsure if this was a cruel family joke or a public execution, Beatrice, my mother-in-law, took a slow, deliberate sip of her red wine. Her eyes were gleaming with pure malice. She had hated me from the day Victoria brought me home. I didn't come from a trust fund. I didn't have a summer house in the Hamptons. To Beatrice, I was a parasite. I picked up the document. I did not need to read every single word to understand exactly what was happening. I had spent years secretly analyzing risk and reading the fine print of commercial real estate contracts that were far more complex than this petty, insulting attempt at extortion. I scanned the key clauses, my eyes jumping from paragraph to paragraph. It was a trap, a beautifully constructed, viciously cruel trap. The terms were deeply insulting. According to the paperwork, I would receive the marital home, a sprawling, massive property on the north side of the city. To the outside world, it looked like a mansion. But I knew for an absolute fact that the house was leveraged to the hilt with 3 different mortgages. It was not a real asset. It was a sinking ship of massive debt designed to drown me. There was a lump sum payment of $50,000 framed as a generous parting gift, and a monthly stipend that would barely cover the exorbitant property taxes on the house they were dumping on me. All my rights to her retirement accounts, her 401k, and the company shares I had helped her build were completely waived. But the real kicker was the NDA. In exchange for this absolute financial ruin, I was to agree to a lifetime of total, unbroken silence. I could never speak about Vanguard Ridge. I could never speak about Victoria's tenure as CEO. I could never speak about the financial irregularities I had seen over the last decade. If I signed this piece of paper, I was agreeing to be erased from existence. See, this is why families with real wealth need to be extremely careful, Reginald announced to the table, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. He gestured toward me with his silver fork, treating me like a zoo animal. You give a man with no background a little bit of access, you let him play in the big leagues, and he thinks he owns the place. People should know their place. Sometimes you have to forcefully remind them where the exit is. The humiliation washed over me, hot and prickly, starting from the back of my neck and spreading to my chest. I could feel the eyes of the VIPs boring into the side of my head. They were watching the CEO's husband be completely stripped of his dignity between the main course and dessert. They expected me to yell. They expected a massive scene. They expected me to throw a glass of expensive wine, flip the table, or get down on my knees and beg for my marriage. Victoria leaned in closer to me, her voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper. Sign it, Julian. Do it right now, in front of everyone, and we keep this civilized. Fight me on this, and my lawyer will bury you in legal fees until you are living in your car. You have nothing without me. Do not make this harder than it has to be. I looked at her. I really looked at her. I looked past the expensive makeup and the designer dress. I saw the deep, pathetic weakness hiding behind the corporate bluster. I saw the desperate, clawing need for validation that I had spent 10 long years feeding. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not give them the satisfaction of my pain. I reached slowly into my tailored suit jacket pocket and pulled out my own pen. It was a heavy, silver fountain pen that my father had given me when I graduated college. I uncapped it. The sound of the scratching nib was the only thing I could hear in my ears. I turned to the last page of the divorce settlement. I signed my name. I dated it in sharp, clear handwriting. I turned to the NDA. I signed that too. I signed the waiver of rights. I signed the transfer of the debt-ridden real estate. I signed every single page with a steady, robotic hand, flipping the heavy sheets of paper with a rhythmic snap. The room went entirely, terrifyingly quiet. They were completely stunned. Beatrice actually stopped chewing her food, her jaw hanging slightly open. Victoria blinked, her smug expression faltering for a split second before hastily reassembling into a mask of triumph. She thought I was broken. She truly believed I was rolling over and showing my belly like a frightened, beaten dog. I capped the silver pen and placed it safely back in my jacket pocket. I pushed the freshly signed papers back across the table toward her. There, I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely even. It is all yours, Victoria. She snatched the papers up immediately, checking the signatures as if she could not believe her incredible luck. She let out a heavy breath she had been holding. Good boy, she said, her voice dripping with extreme condescension. I stood up. The heavy wooden chair scraped against the hardwood floor. A harsh, grating sound that made two of the older investors physically jump in their seats. I smoothed the front of my suit jacket, buttoning it with one hand. "I need some air," I announced to the table. Victoria waved a hand dismissively, already turning her back to me to talk to the man on her right, ready to accept another round of congratulations. She had exactly what she wanted. I was no longer a human being to her. I was a loose end that had been cleanly tied off. Before I walked away, I leaned down, bringing my face very close to her ear. The smell of her expensive perfume, a scent I used to associate with our anniversary dinners, now made me intensely nauseous. "Victoria," I whispered. She turned her head slightly, clearly annoyed at the interruption. "What is it now, Julian? You just signed for yourself the most expensive sentence of your entire life." I pulled back before she could process the words or respond. I walked away from the table, keeping my back completely straight and my head held high. I could feel Reginald's gaze burning a hole between my shoulder blades, but I did not look back. I stepped out into the corridor. The heavy double doors closed behind me with a soft thud, instantly muting the sound of the party and the clinking glasses. The hallway was entirely empty, lined with plush, noise-absorbing carpet and golden wall sconces. The silence out here was sudden and overwhelming. I leaned against the patterned wallpaper, finally letting out a long, shaky breath. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I had done it. I had baited the trap perfectly. I gave them exactly what they wanted. But now I was alone, and the crushing weight of what I was up against crashed down on me. I was one man against a massive, ruthless corporation. I was going up against a billionaire family with bottomless pockets and absolutely zero morals. Suddenly, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I fumbled for it, my fingers trembling slightly from the adrenaline crash. I pulled it out. The screen lit up with a new text message. It was from a number I had not dialed or texted in 4 long years, but I knew exactly who it was. "Do not leave the room. Dad is coming." I stared at the glowing screen. The words blurred for a second as a wave of emotion hit me. My father, General Harrison. He was actually coming. I looked at the timestamp. It was received 1 minute ago. A sudden, fierce calm settled over my entire body. The trembling in my hands stopped completely. The fear that had been clawing at my throat evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard, military resolve. I was not alone, and I was certainly not the victim here. I put the phone back in my pocket. I adjusted my tie in the reflection of a hallway mirror, making sure the knot was perfect. I turned around. I walked back to the double doors of the private dining room. I pushed them wide open. The conversation inside instantly lulled as I re-entered. Victoria looked up from her champagne, deeply frowning. She had expected me to run. She had expected me to flee into the night, ashamed, defeated, and broken. Instead, I walked back to the table. I pulled out my chair. I sat down. I picked up my water glass and took a slow, deliberate sip, looking directly at Reginald over the rim. I smiled. It was not a nice smile. It was the smile of someone who hears the thunder long before anyone else sees the lightning. I settled in, smoothed my napkin over my lap, and waited for the second act to begin. I drove home alone that night in the absolute silence of a car that felt more like a tomb than a vehicle. The engine hummed a low, steady rhythm that violently contrasted with the absolute chaos I had just left behind at the hotel. The streetlights of the city flashed across the windshield, casting long shadows inside the cabin. But my pulse was not racing. I was not gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I did not scream into the void. Those were the expected reactions of a man who was heartbroken and blindsided. I was not heartbroken. I was calculating. When I pulled into the circular driveway of the sprawling colonial house on the north side, I sat in the car for a moment, just staring at the massive structure. This was the house that Victoria had so graciously bestowed upon me along with its crippling mortgages. It looked like a dream home, a symbol of American success. But I knew the truth. It was a financial prison. I did not turn on the lights when I unlocked the front door. I walked through the massive foyer in the dark, my shoes clicking on the imported marble with a sound that echoed like a slow, steady metronome. I navigated the vast space purely by memory. I walked past the massive living room. This was the room where we used to host extravagant corporate Christmas parties, where I would spend hours arranging catering while Victoria worked the room, taking credit for everything. I walked past the formal dining room. That was the room where Beatrice, my lovely mother-in-law, had relentlessly criticized my choice of wine, my cooking, and my general existence for an entire decade. I remembered one specific Thanksgiving dinner where Beatrice looked at me across the turkey I had spent 8 hours preparing and said, "Julian, it is so nice that Victoria lets you play house while she handles the actual adult responsibilities in the world." I had smiled and taken it, because I loved Victoria. Or at least, I loved the version of Victoria I thought existed. I went straight to the master bedroom, walked into the massive walk-in closet, and pushed aside a long row of expensive designer winter coats that I would never wear again. Behind a false wooden panel in the wall, which Victoria genuinely believed was just an access door to the house plumbing, sat a heavy, fireproof steel safe. I spun the dial, left to 32, right to 14, left to 88. The internal lock tumbled with a satisfying, heavy click. I pulled the steel door open. I bypassed the velvet jewelry box containing the expensive watches Victoria had given me as apology gifts over the years. Apologies for missed anniversaries, canceled vacations, and late nights at the office. I reached past a thick stack of emergency cash. My hand closed around a massive, heavy black accordion folder. I called it the marriage file. I carried the heavy folder to my home office. It was a room Victoria rarely entered because she found it incredibly boring. She assumed I used this space to plan neighborhood HOA meetings, organize the household grocery budget, or manage the landscaping crew. That assumption was the greatest, most catastrophic mistake of her entire life. You see, the Vanguard family had always viewed me through a very specific, very narrow, and highly condescending lens. To them, I was Julian the house husband, Julian the support system, Julian the man who looked decent in a tailored suit and knew exactly when to nod politely at investor dinners and keep his mouth shut when the real business was being discussed. They believed my advanced degree in economics was just a useless piece of paper I had acquired to pass the time before finding a rich wife to latch onto. They did not know that for the past 7 years, I had been working entirely remotely, under my mother's maiden name, through a highly secure, encrypted server. I had been working as a senior risk analyst for Maryline, an elite boutique firm that specialized in forensic auditing for distressed corporations. I did not just understand numbers. I understood exactly how criminals hid them. I spent my days hunting for the exact kind of corporate rot that Victoria was trying to cover up with expensive perfume and aggressive PR campaigns. I sat down at my heavy oak desk and turned on my laptop. The blue light washed over the black folder as I unzipped it. Inside was not a collection of love letters or happy vacation photos. It was a graveyard of massive financial impropriety. I met Victoria when Vanguard Ridge was not an industry titan, but a struggling startup bleeding cash in a rented, drafty warehouse. She was charming, deeply ambitious, and completely disorganized. She had massive ideas about manufacturing, but absolutely no idea how to manage cash flow, navigate regulatory compliance, or handle a basic payroll system. I fell in love with her drive. I fell in love with her potential. For the first 5 years of our marriage, I was not just her husband. I was her uncredited, unpaid chief financial officer. I worked a full day at my own demanding job, then came home and worked until 2 or 3 in the morning fixing her broken books. I remember the smell of stale coffee and printer ink. I built the financial architecture that literally saved her company from bankruptcy. I designed the cost-cutting protocols that made her first quarter profitable. I created the risk models that allowed her to secure her first $10 million bank loan. I vividly remembered the night she won a major industry award for Entrepreneur of the Year. I had stayed up for 3 nights writing her acceptance speech. She stood on that massive stage, the spotlight hitting her perfect smile, and thanked her parents. She thanked her mentors. She thanked her corporate lawyers and her investors. She did not say my name once. When I asked her about it later in the quiet car ride home, she laughed it off. She patted my knee and told me investors needed to see her as the singular visionary. She said it confused the market if they thought she was leaning on her husband. I swallowed my pride. I told myself it was a partnership. I told myself I was the foundation, and foundations are meant to be unseen. But the foundation was cracking long before tonight. The dynamic violently shifted 2 years ago. Victoria started locking her phone. She started taking long, hushed calls out on the terrace in the dead of winter. When I tried to ask about the company's aggressive expansion into foreign markets, she would wave a hand, roll her eyes, and tell me I would not understand the complex corporate nuances. She was telling the man who built her entire operational model from scratch that he would not understand how a basic overseas expansion worked. That was when I started paying very close attention to the shadows. His name was Sebastian. He was 26 years old, freshly hired as the new head of internal public relations. I had met him at the company Thanksgiving dinner. He was bright, eager, and looked at Victoria with the kind of blind, pathetic hero worship I had abandoned a decade ago. He drove a brand new, custom black Porsche that I knew on a PR salary he absolutely could not afford. He was exactly the audience she desperately craved. He didn't ask her about debt-to-equity ratios. He didn't ask about quarterly losses. He just asked her how it felt to be an absolute genius. I realized then that I was a walking reminder of her inadequacy. Every time she looked at me, she saw the man who knew the truth. She saw the man who knew that the great Victoria Caldwell still needed help tying her financial shoes. I spread the papers out on the desk. Tonight was not about discovery. Tonight was about assembly. I needed to build a weapon before the sun came up. I picked up a stack of printed emails. I had gained access to her private server 3 years ago when she was too lazy to change her password from her childhood pet's name. I began to sort them into 3 distinct piles. Pile 1 was the shell companies. There were invoices here from a company called Apex Logistics, based in a post office box in Delaware. Vanguard Ridge had paid Apex over $400,000 in the last fiscal year for consulting services. I knew for a fact that Vanguard did not use external logistics consultants. Pile 2 was the kickbacks. Transfers of exactly $9,900, always just under the $10,000 limit that would automatically trigger an IRS flag. The money was sent to accounts linked to members of the city council just before zoning permits were approved for Vanguard's new factories. The divorce party tonight was not a spur-of-the-moment decision. As I sat there in the dark, connecting the dots, the cruelty of it became purely mathematical. She chose the night of her CEO announcement for a specific reason. She wanted to shed her old skin. I was part of the startup phase. I was the legacy infrastructure that was no longer compatible with the new corporate update. She wanted to walk into her future with Sebastian, the shiny new accessory that fit the CEO brand, and leave the glitchy, knowing husband entirely in the past. It was a planned execution. They had rehearsed it perfectly. Reginald's insults, the pre-printed documents, the audience of VIPs. It was all designed to shame me into absolute silence. They wanted to crush me so completely that I would crawl into a hole and never speak the name Vanguard Ridge again. They wanted to rewrite history so that Victoria Caldwell built her empire entirely alone. But arrogance has a funny way of making people blind. I looked down at the documents spread across my desk. In their haste to push me out, in their desperation to streamline their narrative, they had made a fatal error. They thought they were throwing me away, but unlike them, I knew how to read the underlying code. I was not just a discarded husband anymore. I was the architect of their destruction, and I was just getting started. The morning after the dinner, the world outside was bright, sunny, and entirely oblivious. But inside my home office, the heavy blinds were drawn tight, blocking out the light. The air in the room was thick with the hum of cooling fans from my hard drives. I had not slept a single minute. I was running on black espresso and a cold, hyper-focused rage that sharpened my mind better than any stimulant on earth. I reached for my phone and dialed a number I had memorized but never saved in my contacts. It was nearly 8 in the morning. Donovan answered on the second ring. His voice was gravelly, the voice of a ruthless, high-powered lawyer who spent too much time arguing with federal prosecutors and destroying opposing counsel for sport. "Did you sign the papers?" Donovan asked. "No pleasantries. No, how are you holding up?" Donovan was not a man for small talk. "I did," I said, cradling the phone between my shoulder and ear as I used a yellow marker to highlight a line item on a bank statement. "I signed everything exactly as we discussed. The settlement, the waiver, the NDA." "Good," Donovan said, the sound of a coffee cup hitting a desk echoing over the line. "Now they think you are neutralized. They will get sloppy. They will stop looking over their shoulders because they think they have successfully bought your silence with a pile of real estate debt. The house is heavily mortgaged, correct?" "3 mortgages," I confirmed, and she made me waive all rights to her 401k, her stock options, and the company college fund she set up for her niece. "I am completely underwater on paper." "Perfect. It establishes undeniable bad faith. Tell me what you have found in the files." I looked at the massive spread of documents on my desk. "It is not just embezzlement, Donovan," I said, my voice dropping an octave as the realization fully crystallized in my mind. "I am looking at the vendor list. She has been funneling massive amounts of money into a proprietary research project. On paper, it is basic R&D. But looking at the procurement orders, she is buying military-grade components that Vanguard is absolutely not licensed to possess." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. "Julian," Donovan said slowly, his tone shifting from lawyer to warning, "if she is moving restricted tech without a federal license, that is not civil court. That is not a messy divorce. That is federal prison. That is treason adjacent." "I know," I said, my heart pounding against my ribs. "But that is not the worst part." I pulled a specific document from the bottom of the stack. It was a digital printout I had recovered from her deleted items folder just 2 days ago. It was a compliance certification for a massive government contract, specifically for the supply of guidance chips to a major defense contractor. It is a highly sensitive document that strictly requires the signature of the chief financial officer and the independent compliance officer. At the time this document was dated, exactly 6 months ago, the actual compliance officer was on extended medical leave. I stared at the signature line at the bottom of the page. The name signed there was J. Harrison, my maiden name, the name I used before taking the Caldwell family name. I felt a cold chill slide down my spine, colder than the aggressive air conditioning in the room. "Donovan," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "I am looking at a federal compliance certificate. It is dated November 12th of last year." "And," Donovan prompted, "it has my signature on it. Did you sign it, Julian?" "No," I said firmly, the anger rising in my chest. "On November 12th, I was in Chicago dealing with my mother's funeral arrangements. I was burying my mother. I was nowhere near the Vanguard office. I have never seen this document in my entire life." I heard the sound of a leather chair creaking loudly as Donovan sat up straight. "She forged your signature?" "No," I said, leaning in closer to the paper, examining the loops of the J and the sharp slant of the H. "It is not a physical forgery. It looks exactly like my handwriting. She must have used a digital stamp from one of the real estate deeds or life insurance papers I signed years ago. She lifted my digital signature and pasted it onto a federal document to bypass the government audit." The implication hit me with the force of a physical blow to the chest. She did not just want to divorce me so she could run off with Sebastian and his shiny Porsche. She needed to divorce me to bury this massive federal crime. If this project went south, if the Department of Defense audited this contract, she was not the one who signed off on the legality of it. I was. "You are the fall guy," Donovan said, his voice turning hard and clinical. "She set you up as the compliance officer of record without you even being on the corporate payroll. If the feds come knocking, they are coming for Julian." Not Victoria. I looked at the document, at the lie written in black ink that carried my name. All those years of being dismissed, of being told I didn't understand business, of being treated like useful furniture. She had not just underestimated me. She had commoditized me. She had turned my identity into a literal human shield to protect herself from her own felonies. I felt a surge of anger so pure it felt like absolute clarity. She thinks I am her firewall, I said to Donovan. I hung up the phone and stared at the screen. I initiated a secure encrypted bridge between my laptop and the servers of Nadia's team. Nadia was a lead forensic accountant I trusted with my life. We had worked together on dozens of corporate fraud cases. Julian, are you looking at line item 42? Nadia's voice was crisp and professional over the headset. I am looking at it, I said, zooming in on the massive spreadsheet. It is a vendor payment to a company called Northstar Logistics. We ran a deep background check on Northstar, Nadia said. It does not exist. The address listed is a vacant dirt lot in Nevada. The phone number links to a burner phone. But in the last 18 months, Vanguard Ridge has paid them 3 separate installments totaling $1.2 million. Where did the money go? I asked, gripping the edge of my desk. It bounced, Nadia explained, highlighting the flow of funds in bright red on the screen. It went from Vanguard to Northstar, sat there for 24 hours, and then was transferred to a consulting firm in Panama. From there, it was funneled into executive bonus funds and an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. It was a classic round-tripping scheme. Victoria was washing company money through a ghost vendor and padding her own pockets. But then Nadia pulled up a new folder. This is where it gets highly dangerous for you, Julian, Nadia said, her voice softening slightly. She opened a folder labeled Regulatory Compliance. Inside were dozens of PDF files. Safety certifications, environmental impact statements, labor standard audits. Every single one of them bore my digital stamp. I started typing furiously, searching the email archives for any mention of these documents. I found an email chain between Victoria and her chief operations officer, a man named Marcus. Marcus had written, Victoria, the auditors need a sign-off from risk management for Northstar or this gets flagged. I held my breath as I read Victoria's reply, do not worry about it. I have Julian's stamp. Put it on the paperwork. No one looks twice at the husband's signature. He is just a rubber stamp to them anyway. It gives us a firewall. I read the word again. Firewall. An hour later, the doorbell rang. It was a long, aggressive press. I checked the security camera. It was Beatrice, my mother-in-law. I opened the door. She stood there in a designer Chanel suit, holding a Prada handbag, looking at my house as if appraising a property she intended to bulldoze. I see you are still here, she sneered, walking past me without an invitation. I thought you might have had the decency to pack your bags and clear out by now. Hello, Beatrice, I said, closing the door and secretly activating the voice recorder on my smartwatch with a subtle tap. To what do I owe the pleasure? I came to make sure you understand reality, she said, running a finger along the mantelpiece to check for dust. You are a greedy man, Julian. I know your type. You are going to try to squeeze my daughter for alimony. You are going to cry to a judge about the inheritance you think you deserve. But you have no idea what Victoria is worth now. I walked over to the side table and poured a glass of water. I needed to keep her talking. I needed her to brag. I know the company is doing well, but Victoria says cash is tight. The real estate market is tough. Beatrice took the bait so hard she practically swallowed the hook. She let out a harsh, barking laugh. She tells you that because you are simple. Do you really think my daughter leaves her future in the hands of the public market? Please, that Cayman account alone has enough to buy this entire neighborhood twice over. She leaned in, her eyes glittering with pure malice. And the best part? It is completely invisible to U.S. tax law. She was smart enough to move it before the divorce was filed. So dig all you want, you little leech. You will never find a cent. I felt a massive rush of adrenaline. She had just verbally confirmed the existence of the Cayman account and the explicit timing of the transfer. It was a direct admission of hiding assets during a divorce proceeding. It was a felony. "Thank you for telling me that, Beatrice," I said calmly. "Remember your place, Julian?" She snapped, marching toward the door, her heels clicking aggressively on the marble. "You were a guest in our world, and checkout time has passed." She slammed the door. I tapped my watch and saved the recording. I named the file Beatrice Confession Asset Concealment. I sent it directly to Donovan. The storm was fully gathering, and they had no idea they were standing at ground zero. Later that evening, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. It read, "We need to talk. I have the files she told me to delete." I stared at the screen for a long time. There was only one person who would have access to files that Victoria would explicitly order deleted. There was only one person she trusted enough to involve in the cleanup, but who was also coward enough to panic. I agreed to meet him at a small 24-hour diner on the edge of the industrial district. It was a place that smelled of old grease, stale coffee, and bleach. It was far away from the country clubs and high-end steakhouses the Vanguard family frequented. I arrived early, sitting in a back booth facing the door, nursing a cup of black coffee. When Sebastian walked in, he did not look like the shiny, triumphant trophy boy I had seen driving that ridiculous black Porsche. He looked absolutely terrified. He wore dark sunglasses despite the rain outside and kept looking over his shoulder like a hunted animal. He slid into the cracked vinyl booth across from me, his hands physically shaking. "I did not think you would come," Sebastian said, his voice cracking slightly as he took off the sunglasses. He had dark circles under his eyes. "I am curious, Sebastian," I said, keeping my voice completely flat and devoid of emotion. Usually, the mistress waits until the ink is dry on the divorce papers to do a victory lap. "Or did you come to ask for advice on how to deal with Beatrice?" He flinched hard. "I am not here to fight with you, Julian. I am here because I think I am in serious trouble. Victoria is making me do things." I took a slow sip of my coffee. "You are sleeping with a married CEO who is currently under internal investigation for embezzlement and massive fraud. Yes, you are in trouble. But that sounds like a personal problem." "She made me stay late 3 nights in a row," he whispered frantically, leaning across the table. "She gave me her administrative login. She told me to scrub the email archives and delete specific threads before the acquisition audit starts next week. She said it was just cleaning up old corporate clutter. But Julian, I read them. I read the emails before I dragged them to the trash. They were conversations with vendors who do not exist. They were drafts of federal compliance forms with your name on them." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small silver USB drive, placing it carefully on the sticky diner table. It looked so harmless, like something you would use to store college essays. "I did not delete them," he whispered. "I copied them." I looked at the drive, then up at him. "Why bring this to me? You are her shiny new future. You have the Porsche. You have the promotion." Sebastian let out a bitter, dry laugh. "There is no future. Do you think I am stupid? Yesterday, she told me to sign a sworn affidavit stating that I had witnessed you accessing the secure server from home. She wanted me to lie. She wanted me to say I saw you tampering with the files." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "If I sign that and the feds come in, I am looking at obstruction of justice. I am a co-conspirator. I am 26 years old, Julian. I am not going to federal prison for a woman who treats everyone like disposable garbage and won't even introduce me to her father because she thinks I am not rich enough." He wasn't a villain. He was just a selfish, opportunistic coward trying to save his own skin. And right now, his cowardice was my absolute greatest weapon. "What do you want?" I asked, picking up the cool metal drive. "Immunity," he said immediately. "Or whatever the closest thing to it is. If I testify that she ordered me to destroy evidence, if I give you everything, can your lawyer keep me out of the blast radius?" "I will talk to Donovan," I said, pocketing the drive. "But you have to go back to work tomorrow and act completely normal. You let her think she is safe. Stall on signing the affidavit. Tell her you want a lawyer to read it first." I left him in the diner. I got into my car, plugged the USB into my laptop, and routed the files directly to Nadia over the encrypted bridge. 10 minutes later, Nadia confirmed it. We had the smoking gun. We had deleted chat logs of Victoria explicitly ordering Sebastian to scrub the drive and frame me. "Julian, this is gold," Nadia said in my ear. She literally texted him, "Scrub the drive. If anything surfaces, we stick to the narrative that Julian was running a shadow operation. He has the background for it." I called Donovan. "We have it," I said. "We have the intent, the malice, and the premeditation. We need a kill shot," Donovan replied, his voice buzzing with adrenaline. "A blow so sudden and so public she cannot run to the Cayman Islands. The board meeting for the merger is next Friday. She thinks she is walking in to be crowned queen. We need her to walk out in handcuffs, but local police are too slow. They play golf with Reginald. We need federal intervention." I went completely silent. I knew exactly who had that kind of heavy artillery. I had spent years trying to build a life without relying on my father's massive shadow. We hadn't spoken in 4 years because he told me Victoria was a parasite, and I had foolishly defended her. But now, I needed the one thing he possessed in abundance: the absolute authority to stop a moving train. I hung up with Donovan and scrolled to a contact I hadn't called in 4 years. General Harrison, my father, a retired 3-star general and current senior strategic advisor for the Federal Contract Integrity Bureau. I pressed call. "Harrison," his voice barked, "gravel over steel." "Dad?" I said steadily, the word feeling strange on my tongue. "It is Julian. Legally, I am in the kill zone. Victoria is running a fraud scheme involving federal defense contracts. She forged my signature on compliance certificates. She is setting me up to take the fall for 18 months of systematic theft." Silence stretched on the line for 20 agonizing seconds. Then his voice came back, cold and lethal. "Do you have hard data?" "I have the server logs, the bank transfers, a recording of Beatrice admitting to concealed assets, and a USB drive from Victoria's accomplice containing direct orders to destroy federal evidence." "Send it to my secure channel," he commanded. I transferred the files. I sat in the dark car listening to the rain hit the roof. After 5 minutes, he spoke again. "This triggers the FCIB mandate. We have federal jurisdiction. What is the timeline?" "The board meeting is in 7 days," I said. "She is going to force a vote to ratify the forged documents." "Let them vote," my father said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "Fear makes people sloppy, but arrogance makes them dead. Let her walk into that room thinking she has won. Give her that satisfaction. You just ensure you are in that room. She might not let me in. She will let you in," my father promised, and for the first time in 4 years, I heard a grim smile in his voice. "Because she wants to gloat, and when you are in there, you wait for the doors to open. I am bringing the cleaners." "Understood," I said. "Julian," he said softly before hanging up, "when those doors open, do not look at the floor. You look straight ahead. You let her see exactly who she messed with." I lowered the phone. The fear was entirely gone. Victoria had her board members, her mother's cruelty, and her millions in the Caymans. But I had the United States government, and I was about to teach her a masterclass in structural failure. The morning of the board meeting was unseasonably bright, the kind of glaring, relentless Texas sunshine that made the asphalt shimmer and the glass skyscrapers look like blinding monoliths. I drove my modest sedan toward the downtown corporate district, navigating the heavy morning traffic with a bizarre sense of total calm. For the last 10 years, driving to the Vanguard Ridge headquarters meant I was showing up to fix a crisis. It meant I was bringing forgotten documents, smoothing over a vendor dispute, or attending a stiff corporate function where I was expected to stand quietly in the background, holding a glass of club soda. Today, I was driving into the belly of the beast, and for the first time in my life, I was the one bringing the crisis. The Vanguard Ridge building was a testament to the ego I had helped fund. It was 45 stories of imported glass and steel. As I pulled into the underground parking garage, I thought about the days when this company was operating out of a damp warehouse with a leaky roof. I remembered sitting on a folding chair, using a space heater to keep my hands warm while I balanced Victoria's chaotic ledger. I built the financial foundation of this tower, and today I was going to detonate it. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt entirely surreal. It was a sleek, glass-walled chamber that shot upward with a silent hum. The city of San Antonio sprawled out below me, a massive grid of gray concrete and green canopy. But inside the corporate building, the air was heavily filtered and conditioned to a crisp, sterile 68 degrees. I adjusted the cuffs of my tailored blazer. I had deliberately chosen a soft, dove gray suit. It was not a power suit by any means. It was the color of a shadow. It was the color of someone who was completely used to fading into the background, exactly what Victoria and her wealthy family expected to see. I was playing the role of the defeated, broken, and compliant husband to absolute perfection. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. The massive reception area was buzzing with a frenetic, chaotic energy. The acquisition vote was scheduled for noon, followed immediately by a massive press conference in the main lobby. Junior staffers were practically sprinting back and forth wearing headsets, carrying trays of expensive catering, and distributing thick stacks of glossy press kits. Everyone was preparing for the coronation of Victoria Caldwell. I walked past the main reception desk. Fiona, Victoria's personal assistant, intercepted me. She was a young woman in her 20s, someone who had always been quietly kind to me. She looked at me now with a mixture of deep pity, extreme discomfort, and nervous curiosity. "Mr. Caldwell, I mean Julian," Fiona stammered, her cheeks flushing as she corrected herself quickly. "Victoria is waiting for you in the private executive lounge down the west corridor." "Thank you, Fiona," I said, my voice gentle. "It is going to be a very long day. Make sure you take your lunch break." She looked confused by my calm demeanor but nodded, guiding me down the long, thickly carpeted hallway. The private executive lounge was a massive, corner room dominated by a long table made of imported teak and a floor-to-ceiling view of the downtown skyline. Victoria was standing by the massive window, adjusting the cuffs of her expensive silk blouse in the reflection of the glass. She looked perfect, untouchable. She turned as I entered, flashing a practiced, corporate smile that was completely devoid of genuine warmth. Her eyes were hard and calculating. "Julian," she said, taking a few steps toward me with her arms slightly open, as if she were greeting an old business associate rather than the husband she was actively attempting to frame for a massive federal felony. "Thank you for coming in this morning. I know this is highly unorthodox, but my corporate lawyer insisted we tie up every single loose end before the board convenes." She was not alone in the room. Reginald and Beatrice, my lovely in-laws, were sitting in the plush, oversized leather armchairs in the corner of the room. They looked like a king and queen presiding over a peasant's execution. Beatrice was wearing a severely cut, blood-red designer dress that clashed violently with the neutral, soothing tones of the corporate lounge. Reginald was wearing a bespoke navy suit, swirling a glass of sparkling water. "Let us not pretend this is a friendly social call, Victoria," Beatrice said, her voice cutting sharply through her daughter's fake, diplomatic performance. Beatrice stood up and walked toward the teak table, her expensive heels sinking deeply into the carpet. "Get him to sign the final paperwork so he can leave through the service elevator. The board members are arriving in 20 minutes. We absolutely do not need the depressing clutter of your past hanging around the office and ruining the optics for the press." Victoria sighed, giving me a look of practiced, completely fake apology. "You know how my mother is," she said smoothly, leaning against the teak table. "But she is right about the timing, Julian. We need to clear the decks completely before the board votes on the merger. We need a perfectly clean slate." She gestured for me to sit down at the table. I walked over and took the heavy, leather-backed chair opposite her. I kept my hands in my lap, clasping them tightly together under the table. I did this not because I was terrified, but because it took every single ounce of my willpower to suppress the absolute, boiling rage that was rushing through my veins. I had to play the part. "What exactly is this?" I asked, keeping my voice low, intentionally meek, and slightly tremulous. "I thought I signed everything at the dinner party. I signed the brutal divorce settlement. I took the real estate debt. I gave up all my rights to your massive salary, your stock options, the promotion bonuses, and even the college fund you set up. What else could there possibly be for me to sign? It is just a minor, standard formality," Victoria said casually, reaching into a leather portfolio. She slid a single, thick legal document across the polished wood of the table. "It is an addendum, a simple confirmation of the waiver you already signed the other night." I looked down at the document. The bold title at the very top of the page read, "Affidavit of Voluntary Relinquishment and Ratification of Past Acts." I began to read the first paragraph slowly, letting my eyes scan the dense legal jargon. It was not just a waiver. It was a blanket, legally binding signed confession. By signing this piece of paper, I would be officially stating, under penalty of perjury, that I had full, independent knowledge and total operational control over all regulatory compliance matters during the last 5 years of Vanguard Ridge's operations. It explicitly stated that I voluntarily transferred all that authority back to the current executive team effective today, but that I solely owned all past actions. It was the absolute final nail in the coffin. If I signed this document, I was retroactively taking full, undeniable legal responsibility for every single forged document, every fake safety audit, every phantom logistics contract, and every illegal wire transfer she had made to the Cayman Islands. I was essentially handing her a legally binding, signed confession that she could eagerly hand over to the FBI or the Department of Defense when they eventually audited the company. "I see," I said, keeping my face entirely blank, masking the disgust that was churning in my stomach. "You want me to confirm that I am walking away from the compliance projects I supposedly managed?" Victoria nodded eagerly, leaning forward, her predatory eyes locked entirely onto mine. She turned on the charm, dropping her voice into the exact hypnotic, reasonable tone she used to close massive corporate deals. "It is entirely for your own good, Julian. This document separates you completely from the company's future liability. If Vanguard grows aggressively, if we take major financial risks, you are not legally tied to us in any way. I am doing this to protect you from any future lawsuit. I want you to have a clean break so you can start over." She was lying so effortlessly, so beautifully, that it was honestly terrifying to witness. She was looking me in the eyes and asking me to step onto the gallows while promising me it was just a balcony with a nice view. Reginald snorted loudly from his leather armchair. "Protect him? You are way too kind, Victoria. He should be incredibly grateful my lawyers are not aggressively suing him for the 10 years he spent riding your coattails and living off your hard work and my initial investments." Beatrice stepped closer to the table, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. "Just sign it, Julian. Sign it right now and disappear. Go find a nice little administrative job somewhere. Leave the empire building to the adults. You got to play rich for 10 years. Be grateful for the lifestyle we provided you. Take your heavily mortgaged house and get out of our sight." I looked at the heavy, black Mont Blanc pen Victoria had placed right next to the paper. It sat there on the polished wood like a loaded gun. I slowly reached out and picked it up. I hesitated just for a second. This was the precise moment my father had prepared me for. My father had told me on the phone to let her feel completely safe. He told me to let the trap snap entirely shut before making a move. But I was absolutely not going to sign my own legal death warrant without leaving a forensic key for my lawyer. I uncapped the expensive pen. "I will sign it," I said softly, looking down at the paper. Victoria exhaled loudly, a long, shaky breath of pure relief. Her rigid shoulders dropped 2 inches. "Excellent decision, Julian." I turned the page. I did not just quickly sign the bottom line. I carefully initialed the bottom right corner of the very first page. Then I turned to the second page and initialed that one as well. To the untrained eye, to Victoria and her deeply arrogant parents, I was just being overly thorough. I was just acting like the boring, detail-oriented accountant they always despised and mocked. But I was not just initialing the pages. I was actively adding a tiny, almost invisible vertical slash directly after the printed date on each page. It was a highly specific, obscure notation that Donovan and I had used for years in our internal drafts to firmly denote content that was under active legal review, or where a signature was actively being disputed or obtained under severe duress. To a highly trained forensic document examiner, it would create an undeniable, legally recognizable pattern. It would explicitly prove in a court of law that I had read the pages and marked them in a way that legally contradicted the idea of a blind, voluntary agreement. I finally reached the final signature line on the last page. Victoria was watching the silver tip of the pen like a starving hawk watching a field mouse. Beatrice was aggressively tapping her expensive shoe against the carpet impatiently. I wrote my name, Julian Caldwell. I finished the signature with a smooth, practiced flourish, tapping the pen against the teak table with a loud, final click that echoed sharply in the quiet room. I pushed the thick document back across the table. "There," I said, leaning back in my chair. "You are completely free of me." Victoria grabbed the paper instantly. She scanned the signature line, checking to make absolutely sure it was legible and legally binding. A slow, wide, deeply arrogant grin spread across her face. She looked like a woman who had just successfully cheated death, stolen a massive fortune, and won the lottery all in the same afternoon. She stood up abruptly, clutching the paper tightly to her chest as if it were a shield. "Thank you, Julian," she said, her voice dripping with fake, sickening sweetness. She walked over to the sidebar, grabbed a heavy crystal decanter, and poured 2 glasses of expensive scotch. She handed one directly to her father. She did not pour one for me. She raised her glass to Reginald and Beatrice. "To the future of Vanguard Ridge, and to the massive success of the acquisition." "To the future," Reginald replied loudly, clinking his heavy glass against hers. He turned to look at me, a cruel, highly satisfied smile stretching his thin lips, and a very fond goodbye to the dead weight. Victoria took a sip of her scotch and looked at me, her eyes shining with pure, unchecked arrogance. "You know, Julian," she said, her voice dripping with extreme condescension, "I really do appreciate this. I want to be honest with you. You were somewhat helpful in the early days of the company. You were a decent stepping stone when I was just getting started. But the truth is, some people are built for the ground floor and some people are built for the penthouse. You just do not have the killer instinct required for this level of success." Beatrice laughed. It was a high, piercing, incredibly ugly sound that grated terribly against my ears. "Oh, Victoria, please do not be so overly sentimental with him. He was just the hired help, and now we have finally taken out the trash. Let him go cry in his empty house." They stood there laughing together, a family of ruthless predators who genuinely believed they owned the entire world. They were completely drunk on their own perceived power, totally oblivious to the absolute fact that the piece of paper Victoria was holding so tightly was not a shield. It was a tracking beacon for a federal missile strike. I sat there in the heavy leather chair, completely silent, watching them celebrate my supposed destruction. I did not move. I did not get up to leave. I did not argue. Victoria noticed my stillness. She lowered her glass of scotch, a slight, annoyed frown creasing her perfect forehead. "You can go now, Julian," she said, waving a hand dismissively toward the heavy double doors. "The show is completely over. You have your real estate, I have my company. We have nothing left to discuss." I looked at her. I looked at Beatrice. I looked at Reginald. And for the very first time in months, I allowed a genuine, wide, deeply satisfied smile to touch my face. "No, Victoria," I said, my voice incredibly steady, calm, and loud enough to cut sharply through their arrogant laughter. "The show is just starting." She opened her mouth to speak, to ask what the hell I meant, to hurl another insult at me, but the words never came out of her mouth. I thought the worst was over when I signed that paper. I was so incredibly wrong, because the storm was finally here. Behind me, the heavy, solid oak double doors of the private executive lounge did not just casually open. They were thrown violently open with such extreme, explosive force that the heavy brass handles slammed against the drywall with a sound exactly like a gunshot. The arrogant, mocking laughter in the room died instantly. Victoria froze completely. Her glass of expensive scotch halted halfway to her mouth. Reginald spun around so fast he spilled his drink on the carpet, his face twisting in sudden, aggressive shock. I did not turn around. I did not flinch. I did not need to. I knew exactly who was standing in that doorway. I kept my eyes fixed intensely on Victoria's face, watching with pure, unadulterated satisfaction as all the color aggressively drained from her skin, turning her a pale, sickly shade of chalky gray. The air in the room changed in a microsecond. The smell of Victoria's expensive designer perfume and the aged scotch was immediately overpowered by the sudden, sharp, metallic scent of absolute authority. The silence that followed the crashing of the doors was absolute. It was the terrifying, heavy vacuum of a room where all the oxygen had been sucked out in a single second. My father, General Harrison, stepped across the threshold. He was not wearing his decorated military uniform today, but he absolutely did not need to. He wore a dark charcoal suit that fit his broad, imposing shoulders with terrifying military precision. His tie was knotted tight against a starched white collar. He did not look at me. He did not look at the million-dollar view of the San Antonio skyline. His eyes, cold, calculated, and hard as slate, locked instantly and exclusively onto Victoria. He did not speak right away. He did not need to introduce himself. His mere physical presence filled the massive room, pushing the expensive furniture, the millions of dollars in corporate wealth, and the arrogant occupants into total insignificance. Flanking him were two men who were clearly not hotel security, corporate guards, or local beat cops. They wore dark blue suits that were specifically cut to conceal, but the heavy bulge of shoulder holsters was unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. On their lapels, they wore small silver pins, the official insignia of the Federal Contract Integrity Bureau. They did not draw their weapons, but their hands rested casually near their waistbands. Their posture relaxed yet tightly coiled, ready to spring into violent action if necessary. They moved with a synchronized, lethal fluidity that screamed elite federal training. One of the agents, a large man with a severe military buzz cut and a face carved from granite, stepped forward. He held up a black leather wallet, flipping it open with a snap of his wrist to reveal a heavy gold badge and a federal photo ID. "Federal agents," Agent Thorne announced. His voice was completely flat, lacking any emotion, but carrying to the back of the room without him needing to shout. "We are executing a federal warrant for the immediate preservation of corporate evidence and the detention of key witnesses regarding an ongoing, active investigation into massive procurement fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy against the United States Department of Defense." Victoria stood absolutely frozen, her hand still clutching the glass of scotch. The amber liquid trembled uncontrollably, creating tiny ripples that betrayed the violent shaking of her hand. For a moment, her arrogant, corporate-trained brain seemed entirely unable to process the massive, catastrophic shift in her reality. She looked from the federal agents, to me, then to my father, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish pulled onto a dock. This is a mistake," Victoria stammered, her voice cracking pathetically on the last syllable. She tried to muster her CEO voice, but it failed completely. "This is a private corporate meeting. You have absolutely no jurisdiction here. This is a private headquarters." Agent Thorne ignored her completely, treating her words like white noise. He turned his head slightly toward his partner. "Secure all exits. No one leaves this room. Absolutely no digital devices are to be touched or accessed." Beatrice, who had been sitting like a smug queen on her throne just moments ago, suddenly scrambled to her feet. Her face was a mask of extreme, wealthy indignation, but her eyes darted around the room with the blind, frantic panic of a trapped animal. "Do you know exactly who we are?" Beatrice shrieked, her voice shrill, defensive, and breaking. You cannot just burst in here like armed thugs. We are the Caldwell family. We practically built this city. I will have your badges for this. I will call the mayor right now. She reached aggressively into her Prada purse, presumably to grab her phone. The second federal agent moved with terrifying speed. He covered the distance between the door and the leather armchair in 2 incredibly long strides. He did not physically touch her, but he placed his large, intimidating frame directly in her path, looming intensely over her. "Ma'am, take your hand out of the bag and put your hands exactly where I can see them," the agent ordered. His tone was absolutely not a polite request. It was a command backed by the threat of immediate force. Attempting to access any communication device during the execution of an active federal warrant will be considered immediate obstruction of justice. "Do not make me handcuff you in front of this window." Beatrice froze instantly. Her hand slowly slid out of her purse, empty. She looked up at the massive agent. Then she looked across the room at me. Her expression violently shifted from arrogant anger to a dawn of horrifying, soul-crushing realization. She looked at me not as the simple house husband she despised, but as a monster she had accidentally summoned from the deep ocean. "You," Beatrice whispered, pointing a shaking, manicured finger directly at me. "You did this. You planned this. You ungrateful little parasite." My father finally moved. He walked slowly past the federal agents, past the teak table where the signed papers still lay, and stopped exactly 3 feet from Victoria. He did not shout. He did not raise a hand. He just stood there, a terrifying monolith of absolute judgment. Reginald, desperately trying to regain some shred of his shattered patriarchal authority, straightened his spine and stepped in front of his daughter. "Listen here, whoever you are," Reginald said, trying to make his voice sound deep, reasonable, and intimidating. "I assume this is some sort of highly dramatic, illegal negotiation tactic on behalf of my son-in-law regarding the divorce settlement. But I assure you, bringing armed men into my daughter's corporate office is highly illegal, and I will sue you into oblivion." "It is not a negotiation," my father interrupted. His voice was a low rumble of thunder that you physically feel vibrating in your chest. "And these are not my men. They belong to the United States government. And your daughter, Reginald, is about to become their property." "What the hell are you talking about?" Victoria demanded, stepping around her father, though the heavy sweat beading on her forehead told a completely different story. "I have done absolutely nothing wrong. My company is completely compliant. We are about to close a $400 million acquisition. That acquisition is built on a foundation of sand, forged documents, and stolen taxpayer money," Agent Thorne said. He stepped up to the table and slammed a thick document onto the teak surface. It was a federal search warrant, signed by a federal judge. "We have authorized unfettered access to all Vanguard Ridge servers. We have already flagged highly suspicious wire transfers to shell companies and offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands totaling over $1.2 million. And we have concrete, undeniable forensic evidence of widespread forgery of federal compliance certificates." "That is a lie," Victoria shouted, her carefully constructed corporate composure finally, completely shattering. She slammed her hand down hard on the table, rattling the glasses. "You have absolutely no proof of that. Those compliance certificates were signed by the designated compliance officer. If there are administrative errors, you need to talk to him." She pointed a trembling finger directly at me, her eyes wide with desperate malice. "Talk to my husband. He handled all the compliance. He signed every single one of those documents. I just ran the business. I had no knowledge of his shadow operations." I watched her. I watched her do exactly what I knew she would do. I watched the woman I had loved, supported, and built up for 10 long years try to throw me directly to the federal wolves to save her own skin without a single second of hesitation. My father's eyes narrowed dangerously. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. "Is that so?" he asked softly, his voice incredibly calm. "You claim he acted entirely alone? You claim you had no knowledge. He signed them. Victoria yelled, completely desperate now. Sebastian, Victoria breathed, the word escaping her lips in a gasp of pure shock. What are you doing here? Tell them. Tell them Julian had access to the servers. Tell them you saw him. Sebastian stopped near the federal agents. He took a deep, shuddering breath. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed, terrified, but completely determined. I cannot do that, Victoria, Sebastian said. His voice was quiet, but in the absolute silence of the room, it was deafening. What? Victoria hissed, stepping aggressively toward him, her hands balling into fists. What are you saying? I gave them the USB drive, Sebastian said. He looked at her then, and there was absolutely no love, no hero worship, and no loyalty in his eyes. There was only the cold, brutal instinct of survival. The one you gave me yesterday. The one with the emails where you explicitly ordered me to delete the evidence of the forgeries. The one where you told me to frame Julian and lie to the auditors. I didn't delete them, Victoria. Copied it all. I gave it to Julian. Victoria stared at him. Her mouth fell open. The absolute betrayal hit her harder than the federal agents ever could. Her knees actually buckled slightly. She staggered back a step, bracing herself heavily against the window frame. You, she whispered, her voice full of venom and disbelief. You little traitor. I did exactly what you taught me to do, Victoria, Sebastian said, his voice trembling but firm. I looked out for number one. The room fell completely silent again. The undeniable digital evidence was secured. The key witness was in the room confessing. The trap was not just shut. It was welded tight with federal steel. My father took one step closer to Victoria, invading her personal space, forcing her to look up into the eyes of a man who had commanded thousands of soldiers in combat, a man who despised weakness and betrayal. You thought my son was weak, my father said. He gestured toward me without ever looking away from Victoria's terrified face. You thought because he loved you, because he quietly supported you, because he didn't demand the spotlight, that he was soft. You used my son's name as a literal shield to hide your own disgusting, pathetic greed. My father leaned in, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper that carried the heavy weight of Judgment Day. But you forgot one very important thing about shields, Victoria. A shield is made of solid steel. And now the shield has stood up, and you have absolutely nowhere left to hide. Victoria looked at my father. Then she looked at me. The extreme arrogance was entirely gone. The corporate charm was stripped away. All that was left was a terrified, incredibly small woman who suddenly realized she had broken something she could not buy, manipulate, or lie her way out of. Agent Thorne stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. The sound of the metal clinking was the loudest noise in the room. Victoria Caldwell, you are under arrest for conspiracy to defraud the United States government, wire fraud, and obstruction of justice. Turn around and place your hands behind your back. Victoria looked at me. Her eyes were wide, pleading, frantic. She ignored the agent and leaned heavily across the teak table toward me. Her voice a desperate, raspy whisper. Julian, please, please, you cannot let them do this to me. This will ruin everything. The company, the stock, my life. We can fix this. You do not have the guts to destroy me. I looked at the woman I had spent 10 years building up. I stood up slowly from my chair. I smoothed the front of my gray suit. I met her frantic gaze with eyes that were completely clear, dry, and entirely devoid of mercy. I already did, Victoria, I said. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far. You're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. The 48 hours immediately following the explosive federal raid on Vanguard Ridge were a blur of organized, catastrophic chaos. It was the kind of total corporate meltdown that usually only happens in highly dramatized movies or on the front pages of the Wall Street Journal. But for me, sitting quietly in my home office, it was the most orderly, peaceful 2 days of my entire adult life. Because for the very first time in a decade, the massive chaos wasn't mine to fix, manage, or hide. It belonged entirely to Victoria and her family. While Victoria was being processed, stripped of her designer clothes, photographed, and fingerprinted at the Federal Detention Center downtown, the Vanguard Ridge Board of Directors held a frantic, incredibly hostile emergency session. It was absolutely ruthless. Without Victoria there to charm them with her bright smile, and with the massive, existential threat of a federal indictment hanging heavily over the company's plummeting stock price, they turned on her with the terrifying speed of starving wolves. They voted unanimously to terminate her employment as chief executive officer immediately for severe, undeniable cause. They officially stripped her of her multi-million-dollar golden parachute severance package, permanently canceled her unvested stock options, and issued a highly publicized public statement entirely distancing the corporation from her actions. They claimed they were completely blindsided victims of a rogue executive. Nadia's elite forensic team had handed over their complete, devastating findings directly to the board's internal auditors and the federal prosecutors. The corporate directors sat in stunned, horrified silence as they reviewed the documents I had meticulously marked. Every single forged signature, every fake compliance certificate, every phantom logistics invoice, and every diverted fund I had flagged in my detailed timeline was perfectly corroborated by the seized corporate servers. I wasn't just the whistleblower. I had effectively done their entire multi-million-dollar internal audit for them, completely for free. I had handed them the exact map of the rot. My lawyer, Donovan, did not rest for a single minute. While the federal agents were handling the severe criminal side of the equation, Donovan was aggressively attacking the civil side. He filed an emergency motion with the family court, a stack of paperwork thicker than a phone book. He submitted the federal search warrant, Sebastian's sworn affidavit regarding the destruction of evidence, and the irrefutable Cayman Island bank traces as concrete evidence that the divorce settlement I had signed at the dinner was obtained through extreme fraud, coercion, and the massive criminal concealment of marital assets. On Monday morning, I walked into the downtown courthouse for the emergency family court hearing. The air outside was thick with Texas humidity, but I felt incredibly light, as if a 10-ton weight had been lifted off my chest. As I approached the heavy wooden double doors of the courtroom, Beatrice suddenly stepped out of the shadows of the marble hallway. She tried to corner me before I could enter. She looked significantly smaller, older, and far more fragile than she had just 3 days ago in the executive lounge. Her expensive designer Chanel suit was visibly wrinkled. Her flawless makeup was smudged under her eyes, and the venomous, superior arrogance in her eyes had been entirely replaced by a desperate, frantic, bargaining panic. "Julian, wait," Beatrice said, reaching out a shaking, heavily jeweled hand to grab my arm. I pulled away sharply, refusing to let her touch me. "Do not touch me, Beatrice," I said, my voice cold, firm, and completely uncompromising. "Listen to me, please, Julian," she hissed, looking around nervously to see if any reporters or court clerks were watching us in the corridor. "We can fix this. We can make this all go away. I can get you money. Real money. I have access to a massive family trust that the feds do not know about yet. I can wire you $1 million today. Cash. Completely untraceable. Just go in there right now and tell the judge you were mistaken. Tell them you signed the divorce papers willingly and that Victoria didn't force you into anything." I looked at her with genuine, profound pity. After everything that had happened, after the massive FBI raid, after the front-page scandals, and after her own daughter was currently sitting in a concrete holding cell facing decades in federal prison, she still firmly believed this was only about money. She still thought everything and everyone could be bought if the price was high enough. "It is completely over, Beatrice," I said, my voice devoid of any sympathy. "Your money means absolutely nothing to me. Think about the family name," she pleaded, her voice cracking, tears welling in her eyes. "Think about what this scandal will do to us in the press. We will be ruined. I will double it. $2 million, Julian. Please. You owe us. I reached into my tailored suit pocket and slowly pulled out my smartphone. I calmly unlocked it and navigated to the voice memo app. I selected the specific audio file I had recorded in my living room days ago, the one where she brazenly admitted to the Cayman accounts and mocked me for being simple-minded. I held the phone up and pressed play. Her own voice, shrill, arrogant, and deeply cruel, echoed loudly in the quiet courthouse hallway. Do you really think my daughter leaves her future in the hands of the public market? Please, that Cayman account alone has enough to buy this entire neighborhood twice over. And the best part? It is completely invisible to U.S. tax law. You will never find a cent. Beatrice's face went the exact color of old, wet ash. She actually stopped breathing for a full second, her eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated terror as she realized what I possessed. I paused the recording and put the phone back in my pocket. I leaned in close to her, lowering my voice so only she could hear the absolute finality in my tone. If you or Reginald ever approach me again, I said, enunciating every single syllable, I will play the rest of this tape directly for the IRS and the federal prosecutors. I think they would be very, very interested in discussing your specific definition of the word invisible. Beatrice backed away slowly, her mouth opening and closing wordlessly, the fight completely drained out of her. She looked at me not as a former son-in-law, not as the simple house husband, but as the grim reaper of her entire dynasty. She turned on her expensive heels and literally fled down the long corridor, disappearing into the crowd of lawyers and clients. I adjusted my tie, took a deep breath, and walked into the courtroom to finish what they started. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was highly electric and intensely focused. This was absolutely not a standard run-of-the-mill divorce hearing anymore. It was a surgical, legal dissection of a massive con artist. Judge Wallace, a stern, incredibly no-nonsense woman with thick glasses perched firmly on the end of her nose, flipped rapidly through the massive stack of emergency motions Donovan had filed. She did not look pleased. She looked at the undeniable forensic evidence of the shell companies. She looked at the detailed timeline of the North Star payments. She looked at the Cayman Island wire transfers that Nadia had painstakingly traced. Victoria was sitting at the respondent's table. She was not wearing her $1,000 designer clothes. She was wearing an oversized, bright orange county-issued jumpsuit. Her wrists were resting heavily on the wooden table, and I could clearly see the faint red marks where the federal steel handcuffs had been tightly secured over the weekend. Her defense lawyer, a man who usually dealt in quiet corporate settlements, looked visibly sweating and completely out of his depth. Then came the final, devastating twist. The one piece of information even I hadn't fully anticipated until Donovan dug it up that very morning during a deep dive into her recent banking activity. Mr. Caldwell, Judge Wallace addressed Victoria's side of the room, speaking directly to her sweating defense attorney. It appears that the primary marital home, which was so generously gifted to Mr. Julian Caldwell in the initial, highly contested settlement, has a newly recorded second lien on it. I blinked, looking at Donovan in surprise. I knew about the primary mortgages. I knew the house was underwater, but I did not know about a brand new lien. According to these bank records, Judge Wallace continued, her voice turning completely icy, radiating pure judicial fury, Victoria took out a massive home equity line of credit against the property exactly 3 weeks ago, for the sum of $400,000. She then immediately transferred those funds to an offshore account solely in her name. She essentially stripped all remaining equity out of the house, gave her husband the massive debt in the settlement, and kept the cash entirely for herself. A collective, audible gasp went through the few spectators, lawyers, and court clerks in the room. It was so incredibly petty, so vindicatively, needlessly greedy that it shocked even the seasoned, cynical court reporter. She hadn't just wanted to leave me with nothing. She actively, maliciously wanted to leave me in the severe negative. She wanted to drown me in inescapable, crushing real estate debt while she sailed away on my money with her young boyfriend. That is bad faith, plain and simple, Judge Wallace ruled, slamming her heavy wooden gavel down with a sharp crack. The ruling came down like a literal hammer. The original divorce settlement was vacated immediately and permanently. Judge Wallace ordered a full, aggressive forensic accounting of all marital assets, specifically targeting the Cayman accounts and any trusts managed by Beatrice and Reginald. She officially froze all of Victoria's remaining personal assets, properties, and accounts to ensure I received my fair share of the marital estate. She ordered Victoria to immediately pay off all liens on the house or transfer equivalent liquid assets to me to completely cover the debt she had maliciously incurred. And then she added the absolute final kicker. Given the highly egregious nature of the respondent's conduct and her explicit, documented attempt to use this family court to further a federal criminal enterprise, Judge Wallace announced, looking directly at Victoria with disgust, "Victoria Caldwell is hereby ordered to pay 100% of Mr. Julian Caldwell's legal fees." I walked out of the courtroom feeling lighter than I had in 10 long years. As I reached the main lobby, the federal marshals were escorting Victoria out of a side holding room where she had been allowed to briefly conference with her lawyer. The heavy chains around her waist and wrists clinked softly, a depressing, metallic sound. The golden CEO shine was entirely gone, scrubbed violently away by the harsh fluorescent lights of reality and consequence. She stopped walking when she saw me standing by the glass doors. The marshal tugged firmly on her arm, but she planted her feet. "Julian," she said. Her voice was rough, completely stripped of its usual corporate polish and fake charm. I stopped. I didn't owe her a single second of my time, but I wanted her to see me one last time as a free, independent man. "You ruined me," she whispered, shaking her head in total disbelief, still refusing to accept accountability. "I built a massive empire. I gave you an incredibly wealthy life, and you burned it all down. You destroyed me." I looked her dead in the eye. I didn't feel anger anymore. I didn't feel sadness. I just felt a profound, incredibly peaceful sense of absolute clarity. "No, Victoria," I said, my voice steady, calm, and final. "I did not destroy you. I just stopped covering for you. You did the rest completely yourself." The marshal pulled her away. She stumbled slightly, her shoulders slumping as she disappeared through the heavy security doors, heading back to a cell. I turned toward the exit. Standing near the glass doors, looking out at the city, was my father. He wasn't wearing his suit today. He was wearing a simple jacket and casual trousers. He looked less like a fearsome general and more like a dad waiting for his son. I walked up to him. In a Hollywood movie, this would be the exact moment we hugged, cried, and resolved 4 years of bitter estrangement with a soaring musical montage. But we were Harrisons. We didn't do montages. We did respect. He looked at me. He saw the way I was standing. My back completely straight, my chin held up. He saw that I hadn't crumbled under the immense, crushing pressure. "You did good in there, Julian," my father said. "Thank you, Dad," I replied. He hesitated for a brief moment, then reached out and placed a heavy, warm hand on my shoulder. He squeezed it once, firmly. "You kept your cool. You let her dig her own grave. That is the hardest part of any battle." It was the absolute highest compliment he could ever give. 1 year later, my life looks completely, wonderfully different. I sold that massive, debt-ridden house and bought a comfortable, modern place in the city. Using the settlement money and my own savings, I officially opened my own boutique risk management consulting firm. I don't hide behind my mother's maiden name or a remote server anymore. My real name is boldly on the door, and business is absolutely booming. My father and I have dinner every single Sunday. We don't talk about Victoria. We talk about the future. For 10 long years, I made myself incredibly small so Victoria could feel big. I silenced my own voice so hers could loudly echo in boardrooms. I hid my intelligence so she wouldn't feel threatened by her husband. But as I walk into my own office now, the sun shining brightly through the windows, I realize I don't ever have to shrink for anyone again. The world is big enough for me, exactly as I am. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I really hope you enjoyed watching justice be served as much as I enjoyed living it. It took a very long time to realize that setting boundaries with toxic family isn't a betrayal. It is survival. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Have you ever had to walk away from someone who constantly diminished your worth? Share your story in the comments below. I read every single one of them. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey. Until next time, stay strong and know your worth.